I'm Lisa Evers, and this is Street Soldiers.
Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
New York State's new bail reform bill does away with cash bail in many cases. Supporters say it ends discrimination against low-income people, but critics claim it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. Styles P and Akon debuted that song on Hot 97 Street Soldiers in 2003. Fast forward to 2020, and a new bail reform law is on the books as a result of a grassroots campaign led by criminal justice reform groups. Marvin Mayfield was one of those on the front line fighting for change. He says he came home from the Air Force, got caught up in a Bed-Stuy police sweep, and ended up on Rikers Island for 11 months.
It happened to me personally. I was arrested and sent to Rikers Island. I was assaulted. I was hurt, injured, and all this happened because I couldn't pay my way out.
The new law might have spared him the loss of his freedom, says criminal defense attorney Phillip, who supports the new bill.
It doesn't put these low-income defendants in a position to where they have to languish or where they have to plead guilty to offenses that they didn't commit simply because they can't afford to pay the bail. So it basically helps even the playing field.
Many in law enforcement disagree and say the no cash bail law includes some serious offenses. They fear it will create a revolving door for reoffenders and put public safety at risk, especially since judges' discretion is limited. Former NYPD Lieutenant Darin Porcher says it will erode respect for the badge and the law.
We're doing a disservice to New Yorkers as a result of this, in particular the African-American communities and the Latino communities. The communities of color have been under siege for some time because the victimization has primarily happened in those communities.
Some elected officials who supported the legislation are now having second thoughts, but not those who fought for its passage.
We are completely committed, and we will not accept any rollbacks or pushbacks, and we'll be back up in Albany rallying.
The debate over this is sure to intensify in the coming months. Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me for this episode of Street Soldiers, Phillip. He's a criminal defense and civil rights attorney, and he's the founder and principal of the Phillip law firm. Phil, great to have you with us again. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
Thank you. Also with us is someone who's had firsthand experience with the bail situation and the jail situation, Marvin Mayfield. He's a criminal justice reform advocate with Just Leadership USA. They're part of the Close Rikers movement as well. He was also formerly incarcerated on Rikers Island. Marvin, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Dr. Darin Porcher. He's a former NYPD lieutenant, a criminal justice professor, and a law enforcement analyst. Darin, great to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Again as well. Marvin, I want to start with you with your situation, just to give us an idea of what people were dealing with. You were 23 years old, arrested for the first time. Tell us a little bit about that briefly.
Like you said, I was 23 years old. I went into the United States Air Force at 18, signed up. I came home at 22. Walking down the street, Brooklyn, New York, one evening, one night by myself. I was arrested, picked up by the police, beaten by the police, what they did back in those times, and taken to central booking, where I was there for the next few days, right? I was given, ultimately, after going through all of this process, I was given a bail of $10,000, which I didn't have.
And what did they charge you with? And what year was this?
I was charged with burglary in the 3rd degree, and this was in 1988.
Okay.
And this was the first time that I had...
So the height of the crack epidemic, a lot of crime in New York City.
Right, height of the crack epidemic, a lot of crime in New York City, and not a lot of time to sort out who was innocent and who's guilty. Lock them up, let the judge sort them out. And so ultimately I was given a $10,000 bail without any means of support to be able to pay that bail. So family wasn't able to do so. I didn't have the money. As a result, I lost my job, I lost my apartment, I had a car that I lost, and everything that I had been working toward was just lost because of this arrest. So I remember going into C-95 on Rikers Island, and the first thing I remember was the noise and the cages and everything. It didn't take 2 minutes before I got on Rikers Island before I was assaulted the first time. After that, for the next couple of days...
By inmates or by officers?
This was by other people who were incarcerated.
Right.
So I got assaulted then, beat up, and by the time I got to a housing unit, it was a couple of days later. And before I even got there, I could hear the roar and the din and everything else. And I was again assaulted. This time my leg was broken, and I hadn't been on Rikers Island in about 2 days. So my leg was broken. I'm got beat up, and I'm going through all of these things. Basically because I didn't have the money to pay my way out. You know, I mean, lots of people say, oh, I'm there for a crime that I didn't commit, and I hate saying that sometimes because that's the first thing people say, oh, well, yeah, if you're arrested, you must have done something, you know. But there are a lot of people, including myself, who are arrested and put in a situation where they've been given a bail and to no fault of their own. Not everyone that has been taken off the streets and put into a violent situation is guilty or deserves to be there.
Right, and we're supposed to be in America innocent until proven guilty. Phil, how common is the type of story that Marvin just told us?
I mean, it has unfortunately been very common. You know, prior to these reforms going into effect late last fall, and which are now into effect January 1st, 2020, that was the story all too often. And that's a large part of the reason as to why a lot of these reforms went into place. You had a lot of people that were sitting in jails throughout the city and throughout the state that were sitting there for primarily the reason that they could not afford to get out. You hit the nail on the head when, after the story was discussed, you talked about this is America. From a constitutional perspective, you are presumed innocent until proven guilty. This is not cliche. This is the way that our rule of law works. This is the way that our jurisprudence operates. And so if that is in fact the case for everybody, and all things being fair, then everybody that is sitting in jail, the primary reason why you should be sitting in there should not be just because you cannot afford to get out. I'm in private practice now. I'm not at the Bronx Defenders like I used to be. And now, being in private practice, whenever clients generally come into the office, they can all afford to hit any amount of bail generally that is proffered. And from what I have seen just in private practice, we're talking anywhere from $20,000 to $1 million within a day. You know, I have clientele that can get that money and get out. Whereas when I was at the Bronx Defenders, I all too often had situations like this, where I had clients that were sitting in on $500
paycheck to
bail,
paycheck, and
$750 bail, and sitting in on that $500 bail while the rest of their life was going on outside. Bills were still due, rent was still due,
family still needed
needed
support,
to be taken care of. All of these kinds of things that on these minor non-violent offenses, you'd have someone sitting in jail for $750, and it would just ruin the entirety of their life.
Okay, let me bring Darin into this. Darin, was there a necessity for bail reform? When you hear stories like this and you hear about how there were a lot of people that they would spend months and months and months in jail on relatively minor charges just because they couldn't afford the bail.
I'm a proponent for criminal justice reform. However, that criminal justice reform needs to be done smartly. When we take in connection these bails that are set, the precedent should be built upon the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment allows people to have a judge, to have a bail that runs consistent with their income. I give you an example. Harvey Weinstein is someone that's on a bail of $1 million+, whereas a person that's of, let's say, a middle income would get a significantly lower bail based on the income that they have. And that falls within the purview of the Eighth Amendment. But in connection with the criminal justice
bill in New York State.
No, that's always, the Eighth Amendment has been on the books for some time, and that's where it gives judges the ability to implement a bail that runs consistent with that person's socioeconomics.
But what do you think about what we about what we have now in New York?
I think that it's necessary for us to have a series of changes, and with the new bail reform that came in on January 1st, it states that there's no cash bail for these lower level offenses. I'm a proponent of not having bail for first offenders, but when we open it up, the floodgates to people that sell drugs in school zones, people that are arrested for a DWI and they actually hurt
negligent
someone
homicide.
Right, exactly. That would be a criminally negligent homicide. But that's when I think that we need to put the brakes on this and look at it from a more smarter perspective. I think that this is something that was gunshot through the legislator in New York State, and it's going to be too early for us to quantitate it now. This is something that we're going to have to look at from a 12-month period.
Keep looking at. Okay, the big question a lot of people have is, does the new bail reform law take away the discretion of judges? We'll find out when we come back.
This is really truly about fairness. It's not about giving people a free pass.
Let's talk about what this bail reform law actually does. And Phil, you look at the law, you study the law, you have to use the law. True or false? There's no more cash bail for a lot of offenses.
True. I mean, in the respect that, as mentioned earlier, you know, back in the day, let's just say before this whole reform went into effect, you had situations where people were coming in on simple trespass cases, or maybe somebody takes some deodorant out of Dwayne Reed or something along those lines. Cash bail was an option that a judge could give that person. A judge could put that person in jail, set $1,000 bail, and, you know, they would just be lingering on Rikers Island because they took some deodorant or something along those lines. That cannot happen anymore. With a lot of these misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies, there is within these reforms basically a mandatory release on the nonviolent felonies.
But a third-degree assault is no bail.
It is, but like I think
Isn't that a violent crime?
no, it's not like it's violent in the sense of
Physical
the
aggression.
act, but in terms of like legally speaking, is it classified as a violent offense within the New York State Penal Code? No. So I think it's also important just to know what the whole purpose of bail was at common law and just frankly about. Like you mentioned the 8th Amendment. Bail has always been to ensure someone's return to court. Whenever you're arrested, you go before the judge, you read your charges, they let you go. The money has always been there as a means to
make sure you
ensure
show
come
back up.
You don't show back up, you lose the money.
Right.
That's what it's always been about, because remember, you're presumed innocent until proven
Right, but
guilty.
the judges could take into account in the past, they could take into account somebody's potential for committing that alleged crime over again or being a danger to society based on the record. True or false, Marvin?
That's true. In the past, it was an option for the judge to make that determination. But today, I mean, what we're talking about with this new bail reform legislation is what we're really talking about is fairness. Fairness to a group of people who have been historically and typically oppressed and have been the major commodity in the prison industrial complex. We're talking about black and brown people in our communities. And I'm an organizer for New York State, and I'm specifically speaking of New York State, but this is a nationwide crisis, in a country that incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. And it's time that we have made some new laws and new legislation that evens the playing ground and stop using poor and indigent people as the commodity in
As the fuel in the criminal justice machine,
Exactly.
basically, is what you're saying. Darren, in terms of what Marvin's saying, and you know this, I mean, you've spoken on this many times on television and here on Street Soldiers as well. There were years where a lot of innocent men, particularly men of color, were picked up in these big police sweeps on crimes that they didn't commit, and because they couldn't afford bail, their lives are turned upside down if they didn't do something, and even for the ones that it was their first offense. What do you think about that?
I think that quintessential policing should be at the apex of this. We want to ensure that the right person is getting arrested. One wrongfully arrested person is too much. But just going back to what Marvin mentioned earlier in terms of these the disproportionately high number of minorities that are arrested, the communities of color are under siege, and it's necessary that in many instances we fix this ourselves. In that, look, we have an African American person that's assaulting another African American person.
Right.
So now we have black on black crime. That's a problem. In addition to that, we take in consideration the double victimization, meaning we have someone that is victimized by an individual, and that same person, the assailant, gets out 3 hours later and they're back in that same neighborhood.
Phil,
and so when Phil mentions that, look, it's not a violent crime, I tend to disagree.
Phil, just clarify for us, does the judge have discretion, any discretion under the law, this new New York law right now? Somebody comes before him, they've had the same offense, 10 or 15 times previously. Can the judge say, I can't put this person back out on the street to go punch somebody else in the face?
So it depends on what the nature of the offense is. So if we're going to presume that this is the assault 3, okay?
Right.
So if this is the misdemeanor assault 3, it's a nonviolent felony, and person goes in, ultimately released, okay, comes back out, punches another person in the face, arrested for assault in the 3rd degree, comes in, comes back out. In terms of the discretion that's there for the judge, I think now they're going to have to get a little bit more crafty. So,
Marvin, you look like you're shaking your head on that. You got questions?
I'm just saying it because there are certain provisions within this new legislation where judges do have discretion to to impose the cash bail. For instance, if a person continuously misses their court date, they can impose a bail. And so there are other provisions that actually promote public safety within this legislation.
So let me throw this one out to all of you guys, and I'm saying this as a woman. One of the charges that now has no bail is making a terroristic threat, which can be a threat against a person, a threat against a woman. Some guy's harassing you.
Lewd
you file
behavior.
a charge against him. He's not your domestic partner, but so it's like he catches a charge or a similar charge like that, and then you go and you file a complaint with the police, and the guy comes back that night and says, "Hey, you think you can put me behind bars? You can't." You go to the cops, and look what happens. Don't you think that's going to put women at risk?
In the scenario that you just painted,
Right.
the person that will commit that type of repeated offense, right,
Right.
to go back to you and say, hey, look, the law's not working for you, that would be a direct violation of an order of protection, which should be instituted by the judge or at the court at that time. And then, I mean, that person would no longer be on the street. They would be rearrested and would not be eligible for a bail release under this legislation.
But
That's
the
a-
order of
that's a
protections
proper
are not
carve-out, and,
always.
like, that answers exactly what you're saying. Like, to the extent that there's an offense where an order of protection is issued to protect you from having to deal with any, terroristic threats or like future harassment or anything.
Right, the
along those
harassment
lines.
charges are all that.
Correct, but like to the extent that you were having to deal with that, and then that offender comes out and like does it again and violates the order of protection, then the judges have.
But
the
what
same
about just
discretion.
harassment?
guys-
Because
right,
there's a lot
but
of
you
women.
guys
There's a
are
lot of women
stating
that are harassed.
order of
Guys, wait,
protection.
because you're all. This has happened. There's a lot of women that have had guys that have gotten super aggressive. They've harassed them, and then when the woman says no, then they start, stalking
Right.
them for stalkers and that type of thing. And then all you can do is it's not your domestic partner, so you can't get an order of protection, right? Or it's a harassment. You file a harassment charge, and then you get an order of protection.
Right.
And then the guy just gets angrier.
But
You
to
guys
the
are only
extent that-
speaking
but
to the
that
orders of
always existed
protection.
even-
We have a lot of crimes that don't get orders of protection. And these are the same individuals that we're discussing that are going to get out because it's perceived to be a low-level offense.
What in terms of but here's what you're also missing. This is like the flip side of the argument. We're talking about those, but you know who else was getting caught up in a lot of these? There was too much of an umbrella. There was also capturing the trespassers. There was also capturing the petty larceny people, the people that were dealing with drug addictions, right? Like we live in this society
Right.
now where, opioid addiction, drug addiction is
It's
a
not being
medical
looked as a
issue,
crime, right, exactly.
But it still was, and you had these people sitting in jail along with all of the, harassers and terroristic threat makers and things along
These
those
are
lines.
people who were
And
actually threats.
what I'm saying,
Marvin,
is nobody was ever, in terms of like any of the legislatures before this one, taking a look at these laws substantively and making any clear changes to protect them.
Marvin, I want to come to you on this. What do you think about that? And also coming from your experience from what you saw on Rikers Island and the impact that had on your life.
Well, directly, what I have seen, what I've witnessed with my own eyes is that when a person gets arrested and goes to court, goes through arraignment and everything else, there's like a pool of people who come in, and I'm talking about every color and shade that you can think of. Right? So, but it's time to go when people are remanded. It's time to go back to the jail. Who's on those buses? It's black and brown people who are chained and shackled that go back to Rikers Island. The people who have the money to pay their way out, even though they have committed the same exact offense as a person who has no money, has to become the person that stays in jail and keeps the cycle going. And this is really truly about fairness. It's not about giving people a free pass. It's not about saying, okay, well, we're not concerned with public safety, because I absolutely am. I'm a citizen of this city. I have my family who is in the city.
Served
and
your
I am
country?
concerned.
Served your country?
Served my country, yes. And I am concerned about public safety just as much as anyone else. But within that, I'm also concerned about justice. I'm also concerned about fairness. I'm concerned that there has been a historical oppression against a certain class of people that needs to end and needs to stop.
Thank you for joining us. Phillip Hamilton, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you so much. Marvin Mayfield, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Darin Porcher, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers. I'm your host, Lisa Evers. Remember, use your mind as your best weapon. I hope it's your only weapon. Let's push for peace.